Sharon Young. I work at Western Connecticut State University. A lot of WestCon people in the house. And I am going to talk briefly today about working with post 9/11 veterans. So there's a lot of slides in this presentation. Some of them are just going to push through them because this is an hour-and-a-half presentation that is severely condensed down. So we're going to hold all questions until the end. So if you have any questions, like write them down or remember them, and then I will come back to them and we will cover some questions. Oops, wrong way. Okay, so we're going to start talking about military culture. So as social workers, we know that understanding the cultural perspectives that people come from is very important in the work we do. This also includes the military. So there's certain things that are imbued in military culture that is a natural part of how they do their thing in the military. So discipline obviously is very important. When I do work with military members in classroom situations, sometimes they get very irritated at the lack of discipline they find in civilian classrooms. So sometimes they're like, students are texting during class and how could they do that? So things that are normally very disciplined in a military setting, in the civilian setting, maybe not so much. They have very specific acronyms and language, so those of you that work with military populations know that you really have to kind of pick up on what certain things mean. And there's a couple ways of doing that. One, you could stop and ask the client if the scenario is such that it works out that way. Come on in. Sometimes what I do is I just kind of like remember it, and then when they leave, I'll look it up so I don't burden the client with having to define everything for me. There's lots of customs and ceremony and etiquette that's associated with military culture. Today's military is really built on the basis of cohesion, and that they are in squadrons and teams and groups. And so they are always responsible for the person next to them. So they are a very cohesive group. So culturally, they think in terms of like, what can we do for one another? And then within the military, there's lots of different subcultures. So if you are in the Marines, your experience are different than if you're in the Coast Guard and then if you're in the Navy. And then within them, a Special Forces unit has a different experience and a different culture than someone who is in the National Guard for the Army. So all of those things, if you're going to work with military population, you should have some familiarity too. One of the things that if you don't have day-to-day access to people in the military, some of the things you can do is just pick up a book that was written by someone in the military about their military experience, where you start to learn the language and their experiences and things like that. That's a nice way to kind of get exposed to it. I teach a lot about the National Guard because my experience as a clinician was working as an embedded clinician in the National Guard in Connecticut. And so I do a lot of these trainings in Connecticut, and most of our military exposure to veterans and people that have been in the military is through people that are in the National Guard. So in the National Guard, as well as when you're in the regular Army or other military units, there's a cycle that's connected to deployments. And generally an entire unit will deploy together. So you think about that cohesion, everybody prepares together, they leave together, they come back together. So this is very different than it used to be done in prior military experiences through prior wars. So there's a cycle that happens, and so that the military has developed preparation and debriefing and all those things that go with that cycle. So when we're looking at the post 9/11 wars, people use words like OEF, OIF, OND. All those are basically acronyms that describe the different wars that they are in. So one is Iraq, one is Afghanistan, and the other one is Operation New Dawn, which is the operation that came after that. But what we do know about this post 9/11 war experience is that we were really using a very small amount of people to fight a very long, protracted war. Very different. There was no draft for this war. So unlike earlier eras, this force that we have fought the post 9/11 war has been all people that have raised their hand and volunteered to go. And because of that, people have been redeployed over and over again to fight. So they would cycle them in and then cycle them back out to deployments. Or there was times where if you were supposed to go to Iraq or Afghanistan for a 1-year deployment, they would stop loss you, which means, sorry, you're not going home, we don't have anyone to replace you. So they would keep them there. So you may be like a mom, you're deployed, you know, your job may be working with a unit that provides transportation support, maybe you're a mechanic, and then you're supposed to go home and see your kids in November, and then they say, we don't have another unit to replace your unit, so you're staying here. And so there's a lot of wear and tear that happened on the psyche and the physical abilities of the people that got stop-lossed and redeployed because it causes a lot of disruption. The other thing that's interesting about this war when you compare it to other wars is that we use mostly National Guard troops to fight as opposed to previous wars. So a lot of people before 9/11 signed up for the National Guard because they're like, hey, I get college tuition and I get to help my community. A lot of people signed up not knowing, oh my goodness, this is going to involve me having multiple deployments to a war zone. So it was definitely a different experience than in prior wars. Okay, so because of these things, we've had an unprecedented number of repeated deployments, okay? So the time between the deployment and coming back home was sped up so that when people came home, they didn't stay home for the same amount of time as they were recommended by the Army. So the Army, their bog to dwell ratio was 1:3, which means they go to war for 1 year, they come home for 3, and then they get redeployed. The redeployment cycle was sped up because we kept needing more people out there, and they still use the same small army. So what happens is that redeployment takes its toll. And what we know is that people that have been redeployed are 3 times as likely to screen positive for PTSD and depression. And here's where the military culture part comes into play. So if I'm in the military, and let's say I'm in the unit that does support for transportation and I'm a mechanic, and my whole unit is going to be redeployed even though I haven't had a long time at home. I've only been home a year, I'm getting redeployed again. So I may be having some symptoms of PTSD. I may be having nightmares, I may be having some, a lot of anxiety when I'm in open spaces. I'm going to be having some of these PTSD symptoms. Before I go, the military will be kind enough to give me a little survey and say, geez, do you have any of these PTSD symptoms? All right? If I say, yes, I have a lot of these PTSD symptoms and I don't want to go, then I'm going to feel that cohesion of the unit and that duty that I have to the people in my unit. I need to deploy with my unit. Getting left behind from your unit is culturally very difficult for people in the military. So oftentimes I will lie when I come home to make sure that I can stay with my unit, and I'll lie on my PTSD and depression screens so I can go back out. So a lot of times people blame the military, like, why aren't they screening better? Well, they are screening, but because of military culture and that sense of cohesiveness and the duty to others, it causes people to really be deceptive when they're taking their screens because they don't want to leave their unit behind. They don't want to be the person who lets their team down. The other thing that's unique to the post-9/11 war is that the survival rate is so much higher than in other wars. Because we have Kevlar helmets, Kevlar vests, we have up-armored vehicles, so we're having less open head wounds is what we would call them compared to previous wars. People are coming back more often. But the difficulty with all these people coming back with all these injuries that are not life-threatening is that there's a lot of psychological and traumatic brain injury type injuries that happen coming back where we hadn't seen that before. So we have a lot of severely wounded veterans that in previous wars would have never survived whatever impact that befell them. Now they're surviving, but now they have PTSD and an injury. And it's not just like, so we go back to me as the mechanic, right? So if I'm a mechanic, I'm not maybe going to house and carrying a weapon to shoot at people. I may be just fixing vehicles. But when I go from one base to the next, I may be coming across people that have been seriously injured or having to bag dead people. So one of the things that you hear a lot of veterans talk about is that they have had to, after an explosion during a convoy, they'd have to go and cover up people that have died or body parts of people that have died so that they don't get scavenged by animals. So this is the kind of things that can happen to a post 9/11 veteran that can cause that remaining PTSD. So in this survey of, I think this is Marines, 57% of them reported handling human remains. That's a lot of mechanics and drivers and people that maybe their military operations specialty was not related to, dealing firsthand with death. And then in this survey, 28% reported being responsible for the death of a non-combatant. So there's lots of things in the post 9/11 war that creates exposure to things that can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. So I wanted to focus a lot on the transition home. To me, this really speaks to what I see as the challenges that all returning veterans have, whether or not they have PTSD or not. So we know that the vast majority of combat veterans do not have PTSD, but a lot of them have experiences that go along with battle mind. So this is something the Army used to do to train people, and then somebody came along and developed a better system. I still like this one, so I train on this one. So keeping your buddies alive is very important, and having a buddy around you is very important. That's the whole military model, is keeping everybody around you safe. So when you come home, particularly if you're in the National Guard, because you don't come home to live on your military base with all of the people that you deployed with, you're getting scattered all across the state of wherever you are. And so you're only going to see, if you're still in the National Guard when you return, you're only going to see your battle buddies once a month when you go to drill. So you are isolated. You're not having people there to have your back. You also don't have people around you that have seen and done the things that you have done. So you don't have people that understand your experiences. So because you don't have people that share your experiences, and you don't want to traumatize the people around you, including your clinician, to tell them the things that you've seen. If you've had to cover up your best friend because they've had their leg blown off and they've perished in the battlefield, you don't want to go home and tell your spouse that story, because you don't want your spouse to have to live with that thought in their head like you do every day. So there's lots of withdrawal that happens when they come home. The other thing we see in families. So accountability is very important in the military. You don't go anywhere in the military without your weapon. It's part of like who you are. It's part of what you need to do. You're accountable to that. You're accountable to your job in the military. If you don't do your job in the military, believe me, you will hear about it. So you are accustomed to accountability. So if I'm the mechanic mom and I'm used to that well-ordered system where everybody's accountable, and I come home and I've got a 13-year-old daughter who leaves her clothes on the floor of the bathroom, how am I going to respond to that? It's going to cause some disruption, right? I'm in a workplace and the people I work with, those young people, they're not responsible for their jobs and they're not doing what they need to do. It's going to cause a lot of internal and external strife in my life, because when people are not accountable, I might tend to be controlling. So in the military, being accountable is part of the culture. When we come home, sometimes that gets translated into having controlling behaviors where I try to control the people around me, I try to control my children, I try to control my spouse. So targeted aggression. In the military, you need to be taught how to protect yourself and to protect those around you. Targeted aggression is a normal, natural part of military experiences. So when you come home and you feel a threat, so if you are in a bar and somebody walks by and knocks your shoulder, your system that you had in play that protected you in combat, that protected you against enemies, is now, whoop, it's come online. And then you have a bar fight that leads to your arrest. So oftentimes there's a lot of difficulty in managing what's been trained in you, because what the military does is it trains you the same thing over and over again till you have it down in your sleep. It becomes an automatic response. That's how they train. And so when you come home, you still have all that training inside you, and then you have to figure out how to challenge it. So you'll see a lot of bar fights, road rage, all sorts of things happening in post 9/11 veterans because they're still trying to gauge back their targeted aggression that was trained. Tactical awareness. So if I ever have a room of veterans and I talk about tactical awareness, it's kind of one of those family jokes that we all enjoy laughing about. So tactical awareness is when you imagine that when you're driving down in a convoy, down the street in whatever war zone you're at. These are the things you have to look out for. If there's garbage on the side of the road, that could be an IED. If you're driving in a city and there's people that are on the roof of a building, they could shoot at you. If you see an animal that's dead on the side of the road, there could be a bomb implanted in that. If you drive under an underpass, someone could drop an explosive device or shoot at you from that, right? So this is your experience. So no matter what, even my job as a mechanic, I'm still having to get into a vehicle and drive, and I have to have tactical awareness at all times. I have to be aware of threats to myself, my convoy, my fellow soldiers and Marines. I have to be always aware. So that hypervigilance is trained in them, so when they come home, it becomes a dysfunctional way of being. So if you know any veterans, you'll know that if they walk into a room like this, they're not going to sit in the back because there's no way to get out of the room. They're going to sit on the side where they can watch all of you for potential threats, and they're going to keep an eye on the door, right? You go to a movie theater with a veteran, they're not going to sit in the middle of the movie theater where you can best see the screen. No, that's too dangerous. They're going to be always watching who's coming in, who's going out, who's around them. So that hypervigilance is exhausting. If you're always looking for danger, if you're driving down the side of the road and every dead animal you see, there's a part of your gut that goes off and says, oh my God, there could be a bomb in there. So tactical awareness is something that is very helpful in battle, but when you go home, it becomes a source of anxiety. So lethally armed. Whenever I work with veterans, I never ask, do you have a weapon at home? I say, where do you keep your weapon at home? Because if you have spent a lot of your life being lethally armed and feeling the protection of having a weapon with you, if you go home and you don't have a weapon, how do you think you feel? Vulnerable, nervous, right? So a lot of my student veterans that I work with on my campus, they have concealed carry permits. And I always jokingly do a little pat down, you're not allowed to have this on campus. Don't bring your, and they're like, no, we're good, we're good. But oftentimes having that weaponry around is very important for their sense of safety. As social workers, what do we worry about with easy access to lethally suicide, right? Homicide. So any sort of weapons-related danger, we always have to be aware that there's very likely to be a gun or some sort of firearm in the house. Okay, so during battle, you are going to have your best, the people who you rely on. Think about your family and how much you love your family and how much you're attached to your family and how much you worry about your family. That's the experience in battle. Everybody around you is your whole world. You count on those people to keep you safe. Those people have your back, they protect you. So in that world, the very people that keep you alive sometimes die in battle. And so when someone gets killed in action and you're in a deployment area, what's going to happen is they're going to have a quick little ceremony and then you keep it moving. Right? There's no I'm having some problems with grief. I have some complicated grief. There's none of that. You've got to suck it up and keep moving. It's suck it up, drive on, is what you hear a lot of veterans will talk about. So they have to have a level of emotional control. There's no freaking out aloud on a battlefield because if you're in a firefight and the guy next to you or the woman next to you goes down, you can't be like, oh my gosh, what? You have to keep fighting. You need to have that emotional control. The emotional control is what keeps them alive. But when they come home, their spouses say, what's wrong with you? Why are you not reacting to this? Why don't you share with me? Why don't you talk to me? What's going on with you? Why aren't you showing any feelings? So we actually have like a feelings chart that we'll use with military veterans because they have angry and just numb. That's their emotional range a lot of times because they've been trained to have that emotional control. And so one of the things we have to do as clinicians is to teach them about that there's a whole range of emotions out there, who knew? And to have them start to experience them and feel safe in experiencing them. So OPSEC is operational security. So oftentimes there's things in the military that you've been given to do that you don't tell anyone about except for the people who absolutely need to know it. So what happens is because you've been trained in that OPSEC sort of model, you come home and you maintain OPSEC, which is ridiculous. So I'll give you an example that a colleague says to me. She had a student who worked at a retail store in a mall. And so she was like, oh, the new fall line is coming out or whatever. And then someone's like, oh, well, what's in it? And she's like, well, I can't tell you that. That's a secret. So oftentimes people from the military will keep things secret because it's part of their culture, it's part of what they do, and they don't necessarily feel comfortable divulging those secrets. So you can imagine in a family situation how challenging that might be. Okay. I have met a lot of veterans who have that sense of responsibility for other people. So you have to be responsible for yourself, your weapon, your safety, but more importantly, you're responsible for those around you. So if you've been told you need to look out for your battle buddy, you need to watch out for your battle buddy, and your battle buddy gets injured or gets a TBI or dies, how does that make you feel? So that's a profound amount of guilt because the whole culture is about accountability to one another, accountability to the higher-ups. And if you have failed to do that, you're going to be walking around with a lot of guilt. So when we talk about veterans, oftentimes we talk about suicide and PTSD, but we're not talking about detachment, secretiveness, guilt. These are the maladaptive behaviors that come from their military training and not necessarily from a psychological pathology. Most veterans that I know don't like to have a diagnosis. They don't want to be that guy with a PTSD or that woman with the depression because of her deployment. But these are realities of their training that is maladaptive in the civilian world. So one of the things that's helpful is teaching them about battle mind because it's something that you can share with them and kind of have a little chuckle about because sometimes you can be like, okay, well, let's talk about your driving. So if you ever have a chance to Google a video about driving in Iraq or driving in Afghanistan, take a look at what it's like driving there because people are coming at you from all ends, and if you stop, if you're in a convoy or you're just driving your Humvee and you stop, you become an automatic target, and that's really dangerous. You already know about the overpasses, the dead animals, the garbage, so much risk. And so veterans get very nervous oftentimes if they're driving and traffic slows down because their automatic system starts lighting up like, I am in danger, I am in danger. And so aggressive driving is what kept them alive in combat areas, but it causes a lot of problems in the civilian world. Okay, so this is a lot of, connected to accountability, where there's a lot of discipline and order in the military, things are done a certain way, and then you come home to an organization or a family, and you can see where that would cause a lot of conflict. And so I was chatting with one of my friends the other day, and she referred to one of her colleagues as recovering Army. And she didn't know who she was talking to, so I had to be like, okay. Right? Because she was trying to refer to the fact that they really gave priority to discipline and ordering, and she did not find that to be a valuable thing. So she had a lot of conflict with those people. So I had to give her the whole, military culture chat, as I tend to do. So when you have people that are coming from combat and they're reintegrating, they are overwhelmed by everything around them. So imagine if you were at one point walking in Afghanistan in a city, and there's people that are on rooftops and there's people on balconies, and all of those people are a threat to you and the people around you. And then you come home and go to whatever mall that you guys live near, What is the feature of almost every mall? There's the first floor and then the second floor with balconies, right? Imagine how much your nervous system would light up if you were to walk into a mall. So here we have a big spousal fight. So let's say I return, I'm the mechanic. Every time I go into a city, I worry I'm going to get killed. And I'm walking into the mall with my spouse, and I'm like, I got to get out of here. I start sweating. I start panicking. I start feeling concerned. It's because my body doesn't know the difference between a city in Afghanistan and the mall. It just doesn't know the difference. It just sees threat. And so that's part of the transition, is trying to get de-escalated from knowing where the threats are and where they are not. And that takes some time. There's a big culture shock. A lot of people prefer to be at war. I see this a lot with student veterans, where war, you have somebody who tells you exactly what to do. You know what your mission is. You know what you're doing every day. Everybody around you is accountable and doing what part of the mission. And then you come home to college and nobody's listening in the classroom. Nobody's telling you what to do. The professors just let whatever happen. It feels very not very comfortable because it's going against your military culture. And if you spent a lot of your life training to do one thing, and that is to go to battle, and you're good at it, going to war is sometimes where you feel comfortable, where you feel like you're using your skills. So if you spent a year or two here at Fordham and then you went out into the business world, you'd be like, well, I want to use my social work skills. I'm trained. And they'd be like, well, you can work at this nice startup where they give you free lunch, or you can work at this terrible social service agency where you have to clean your own bathroom. You're like, I'll go to the social service agency because that's what I was trained to do. And so a lot of times civilians have a hard time understanding that difference. Obviously, with deployments and families, the shift in the roles and the structure of the family, you leave for a year, your entire family changes its homeostasis. When you return, you have to reintegrate with your family again and figure out where your role is, how much your kids have changed in the year that you've been gone. There's lots of changes. One thing everybody knows is that once you've had a deployment experience, you're not the same person you were before. The IAVA is an organization for Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. I like using their data because they survey, this is all on the IVA site. They survey not just veterans that go to the VA, because what we do know is not a lot of post 9/11 veterans are coming to the VAs at the same number as veterans from other wars. So these surveys go to the population that are identifying as Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, and they're not necessarily people that are hospitalized or have a disability or any of the, they're just regular sort of members of the veteran community. So when they asked about what their injuries were, the first one are muscular skeletal joint injuries. If you've ever picked up a military rucksack, it's wicked heavy. And so if you've had to carry that around for miles and miles and miles and then get crammed into a vehicle that's going in the worst roads ever imaginable, you can see where those things happen. PTSD is number 2. So this is what they're self-reporting as their injuries. PTSD is number 2, followed by, I never pronounce this right, who's got medical training that can pronounce the thing when you can't? You got ringing in your ears. Tinnitus. Okay, that's how I pronounce it, but I wasn't sure. So the ringing in the ears comes from explosions, firing weapons. So oftentimes, if you're meeting with veterans, you can probably guess that they're going to have some difficulties with hearing, sometimes with one ear, sometimes with both. Anxiety, depression, hearing loss, TBI. These are just what are your service-related injuries. Now, it says injuries, that's a cultural thing, right? They don't want to talk about their mental health diagnoses or the disorder they have. They'll talk about what injuries they have. That's why they asked that question. So 84% believe that the veteran community are not getting the care for what they need for mental health injuries, okay? This is why. The stigma for getting help is too great. The access to care they have, but not quality care. And then some of them have access problems. They don't have access problems, but they have trouble getting themselves to go get help. So seeking care is really difficult for veterans. They're taught to be reliant on themselves, to suck it up and drive on. If you've been taught to suck it up and drive on, you're not going to be like, oh, hello, MSW clinician, I need some help. It's really challenging. So when I think about, like, my dream is to, like, set up a little side business where I'm working with post 9/11 veterans doing clinical work, but I have to think about what to call it. So I keep, every time I go into groups of veterans, I'm like, what should I call it? Because I want to call it counseling. So if there's one thing you can take away from this talk today, is that, that most combat veterans do not have PTSD, but they have a lot of the other things that you saw in the battle mind. So part of the way that they don't fit into civilian culture is based not on the fact that they have a trauma-related injury, but it's based on the fact that they've been trained for a war experience and not for the civilian world. So most studies will have a range between 12 and 30% of service members and veterans having PTSD. As time goes by, you'll see the rates of PTSD will go up. As veterans spend more time in the civilian world, their PTSD will go up. Oftentimes, they'll spend a lot of time in denial of the fact that they're having these symptoms. This is also very important. I think women veterans are often not paid significant attention to. And looking at all women and men and women's veterans and men's veterans, women veterans reported the highest level of interpersonal violence, particularly sexual assault and intimate partner violence. So women veterans suffer not just in the battlefield, but they also suffer in their family situations and also in their workplaces. So the rates of depression are similar to when you're looking at male and female. Women tend to suffer, just like in the general population, more of depression. So there's a range of depression that you see in veterans and National Guard troops. So we do see that in National Guard troops, the rates of depression and PTSD were higher than people in active duty because they're separated from one another. They don't have that support. If you live on a military base, the military culture protects and supports you. If you are in the National Guard, you don't have that same degree of support. And social support is very important in military populations. We all know that veterans have a significant issue with suicide that's above and beyond what you see in civilian populations. And so it's important to look at their emotional numbing and their cognitive affective connections that they have. There's a lot of guilt and survivor's guilt that happens with veterans, and a lot of them have difficulty really managing a civilian life after having a life in combat. And the other thing that's important to know is that because they have exposure and access to lethal methods, that definitely will play a role in that. If you have a gun, it's much easier to be successful at suicide than if you don't. So asking the group of Iraq and Afghan veterans of America, 43 reported suicidal ideation, having suicidal thoughts since joining the military. That's going up. So this is a 2019. 59% know a post 9/11 veteran who has died by suicide. So we know, working with other populations, that suicide has if you know someone that's committed suicide, it creates your thinking about it, your likelihood of having suicidal ideation. And 65% know someone who's attempted a suicide. So this is a significant issue to screen for. So I just wanted to show this picture really quickly. How do you rate your health before joining the military? You see the yellow is excellent. And then after their experience with the military, the yellow is much, much smaller. So, so the three most important issues identified by veterans themselves were mental health and suicide prevention, employment and jobs, and fixing the VA. The VA is the largest health system we have in the United States. It's going to take a long time to fix. So I'm going to wrap here with the unique issues that we have to look out for veterans that a lot of times people don't talk about. One is anger, just straight up anger. How do they manage their anger? How do they deal with their anger? How do their families experience anger? The other one is sleep. A lot of post 9/11 veterans struggle with sleep. And it's something that I always ask is, how are you sleeping? So I had a student veteran who came to me and he was struggling with sleep, And I'm like, tell me about your sleep experience. He's like, I'm having nightmares. Once I wake up, I can't get back to sleep. My mind just keeps racing and racing. And then in the morning, I have to go to my Arabic class. And I'm like, okay. So maybe the Arabic class may be causing some, some exposure to things that may be reminding you of your experience in deployment, and we need to think about that. So sleep is something that is very important to assess. A moral injury is when you have done something or been part of something that you question the morality of. So if you are someone that believes that, killing is wrong and you've experienced killing yourself, you have a moral injury. One of the things that people have had to do is when they're deployed, they would have to shoot dogs. They shoot dogs so the dogs don't eat their friends who have died. So that's a whole bunch of moral injury right there, right? So there's lots of discussion about moral injury. There's not a lot of treatment modalities that really talk about that. Obviously, having the combat stress and PTSD, difficulty in connecting with spouses and loved ones, and that emotional numbing piece. What they're finding as far as treatment goes is the VA recommends exposure therapy, CPT, which is cognitive processing therapy, which is similar to cognitive behavioral therapy, but with a slight exposure component that is, yes and no used. EMDR is also recommended, but a recent study by the Journal of Medicine indicated that even the best modalities that they've tested and recommended through the VA are only effective in 50% to maybe even a third of the cases. So the training that you get and the clinical work you're doing, you can do with military populations, but you have to do it with the understanding of their military experiences. Questions? Yes, ma'am.
It almost seems like, which is not a rational thought, but it almost seems like people returning from a combat experience need to almost be in a decompensatory bubble or an environment that they and their families can really go through these issues before they get, because you see the picture of them landing and they get
the party, yeah. Yeah, everyone's watched those videos. Yes, yeah. It's interesting because in prior wars, there used to be this nice slow boat ride that took you from whatever war you were in to back home, and that was like a nice decompression time. Now what they do is they kind of hold you on a military base for like 2 weeks, and they give you a lot of PTSD scales, which you all lie on, and then you go home. So it definitely, and other cultures are much better at integrating their veterans than the American culture is.
So kind of picking up on what you were saying about the slow boat, sort of what I'm wondering about is looking back historically. So for me personally, my father was a Vietnam veteran, then was in the Guard for 37 years, was deployed to Desert Storm. Mm-hmm. My grandfathers were World War II veterans. And what I'm wondering about is, I feel like, we know more about PTSD now. Especially, it seems like since after Vietnam, there's a lot more understanding of what it was like for people to come home. Mm-hmm. Not so much in the generation of World War II.
No.
And what I'm wondering, does that have to do with sort of what you're talking about, people coming home with more serious injuries, more people surviving with more traumatic injuries and seeing more, whereas in World War II and even in Vietnam, more people died on the field and maybe weren't coming home with...
People didn't come home as often from other wars. That is
right.
Absolutely true.
So are we seeing more PTSD, or are we seeing more survivors of war? Is it that we have a language that we didn't have before?
I mean, PTSD wasn't defined as a war-connected thing until like 1980-something, okay. Right? And so they just didn't have the language. And although since the time of, since wars began, people have recognized that, and you can read very old Greek plays where they talk about trauma, but we just didn't have the language for it. And so, and other things is that the VA and the Department of Defense have really spent a lot of money and invested time in research and looking at these issues because they see how it impacts their workforce. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think it's a lot of awareness and acknowledgement that's been happening, and a lot of research. There's a National Center for PTSD that is situated and connected to the VA across the country, and they are the most remarkably smart researchers doing a lot of amazing things about PTSD.
Is the military making adjustments to address these issues when, you know, the soldiers are fully engaged with them versus when they come home? Are there?
They actually do. They have what's called resilience training, which is based on the work of Martin Seligman, who's a positive psychologist. And so they try to really build resilience in the troops and to the whole DoD population. But I think there's only so much protective stuff you can give somebody when you expose them to the difficulties that they occur in war. So, yeah, they do their best given how big an organization it is. Any other questions? Awesome. Thank you very much for your time.